Welcome back for another episode of the Leader of Learning podcast, the show where educators can come find inspiration to transform education through effective leadership. I'm your host, Dan Kreiness. Let's get started.
Yes, I am looking at a podcast, if that makes any sense. I believe this is a first for me, short of sampling part of a podcast for a video long ago. Thus, this video will understandably be a bit light on the visuals, so I will at least add photos of the speakers involved so we know who we're hearing from. First up is the host of the Leader of Learning podcast, Dan Kreiness. In addition to his podcast and blog of the same name, Dr. Kreiness is the academic standards facilitator for a middle school in Connecticut, possesses a bachelor's degree in journalism, as well as 2 master's degrees and a doctorate in various areas of education. His guest today, who we will meet shortly, is Dr. Sheldon Akins. Dr. Akins is presently the Director of Special Education at the Shoshone-Bannock School District and has an extensive career in education. He has a bachelor's degree in social science, a master's in higher education leadership, and a doctorate of philosophy for K-12 education studies. He also hosts his own podcast called, appropriately enough, Leading Equity. Certainly, 2 qualified experts on the subject of education. So, what's the topic for today then?
In this week's episode, we're going to tackle a difficult to discuss yet necessary topic in the field of education today, and that is equity.
Ooh, equity! I'm so surprised. And just as a primer, the dictionary definition of equity is the quality of being fair and impartial. It should also be noted that equity is synonymous with the word and concept of justice. But okay, why is equity something that is difficult to discuss in the realm of education?
Equity presents itself in education in so many ways. Later in the episode, you'll hear me refer to the fact that equity could mean everything from racial equity to socioeconomic equity to even digital equity. And in all 3 of those cases, and any case regarding equity, we're talking about how some students have access to resources or certain advantages over other students for a variety of reasons.
Okay, already I am confused. You have just tied the concept of equity to several specific categories of things. Racial equity, socioeconomic equity, and digital equity. That doesn't then modify the meaning of the word equity itself. Equity does not then mean different things. You're just talking about different things and whether they are treated or distributed fairly in the classroom. Though, how you're going to resolve socioeconomic equity in the classroom is maybe the most boggling, because unless we're talking about private school, public education is, public. And digital equity? I mean, if a school has a computer lab, unless you're banning certain kids from using it, then they have computers to use? Or are we talking about tablets? Or Nintendo Switches? Golly, I am already very, very bewildered. Let's hope that we get some clarification.
My next guest is a fellow podcaster, well-respected in the space, has his own great show that he will tell us all about in a second. But Dr. Sheldon Akins is here to join us to talk about equity. And if you could, introduce yourself. Tell us who you are, where you are, and what you do.
Hey, Dan. Thanks for having me on the show.
I am going to skip over this part, as I gave a summary of Dr. Akins and his credentials in the introduction. And as we proceed, I will only be covering some of what I found to be highlights of the podcast, as the entire thing runs about 30 minutes. If you would like to listen to the entire podcast for yourself, a link is in the description.
I also do some consulting with the Leading Equity LLC. And so I'm all about talking about equity and ensuring that our schools are equitable when it comes to classroom instruction and when it comes to systemic and even policies and things like that. I'm a big time advocate for equity within our school system.
Okay, we're still talking generalities and abstracts. When do we get to the details?
Well, you told us a little bit about your show, and obviously equity is a big topic. I guess if you could start off sort of generally speaking about what it is that you deal with on your show, and I guess again more generally, just the good, the bad, and the ugly, I think is really where I want to start in terms of this educational equity piece.
Okay, so the show it focuses on supporting educators with the tools and resources necessary to ensure equity at their schools.
And equity means what again in this context?
So usually I have a lot of my guests are researchers. So I talk to a lot of higher education professors, and I'm an avid reader, and I'm always trying to learn. I mean, we're as educators, we're lifetime learners, and so I do a lot of scouring of articles that center around equity. And sometimes I'll find something that's just so eye-popping for me, or maybe on a topic that I'm not as familiar with. And so I'll reach out to them and I'll say, hey, I just read your manuscript. I just read your article in this journal, and I'd love to have you on my show.
So you don't know what equity in the classroom means, because at any point you might read an article by someone with a new interpretation of what it means, when all equity actually means, at least put simply, is fair treatment. I remain stumped as to why such a concept requires this much convolution.
Equity is such a broad topic, and so I cover such a wide range of topics that center around, how do we provide fairness and ensure that each student is getting their individual needs and not providing this one-size-fits-all cookie-cutter approach to education.
Well, that wasn't so hard now, was it? You could have just led with that. Seeing to each student's needs to help make sure they get a quality education. I mean, there has to be some general standard in a classroom curriculum. Short of having a personal tutor, not all of a classroom education can be tailored to each individual student. But then, this is why you have progress reports that show how a kid is doing in the various areas of learning, and that tells both the teacher, and hopefully the parents, what a kid needs to concentrate on doing better at. At least, that's how things worked when I was in school. So, if not regular progress reports to help guide a teacher on which kid needs what help, what are the other methods of ensuring educational equity? Now, will I get an answer to that question? I have no clue, but I don't hold out much hope.
Okay. So, as you said, and I'm glad you said it, there are so many facets to the equity piece. I mean, it's everything from digital equity and fairness as it relates to connectivity and devices, and all the way up until obviously like racial equity.
Digital equity. Racial equity. But weren't we just talking about providing a good education student to student? I mean, I know you cannot escape technology these days, but isn't that tangential to your basic best practices? And how exactly do you institute racial equity into the classroom? I mean, if you just treat all the students fairly, I must be missing something.
So there's a lot that we could talk about. Let's focus mostly on the racial piece.
So you want to focus on the racial piece. Got it.
I'm going to be honest, it's a topic that I don't jump at the chance to cover.
But You just did.
But it is super important. I recognize the need to talk about it. And I think, correct me if I'm wrong, I think it's being talked about more. We're certainly seeing more and more stories about it. And I might be dating us here a little bit because I'm not, this is probably several weeks before the episode is going to air, but I just saw, again, some coverage about this story with a black student who got a new hairstyle and had like a design, shaved into his head, like a lightning bolt or a letter or something. And one of the administrators, I don't know if it was the principal, I think it was the assistant principal, colored in the space with permanent marker. I mean, that screams, what's the opposite of equity? Like not fair, unfairness, right?
Right?
No. That is the opposite of relevant, actually. I mean, don't get me wrong, that assistant principal was an idiot. Whoever they were, because I can't find a story that gives their name, they tried to resolve what they saw as a dress code violation for extreme haircuts by coloring in a kid's scalp. But what does that have to do with equity? And what does it have to do with race? I mean, the kid had black hair, and the idiot used a black marker. If this is your first example as a problem with racial equity, then we are off to a weak start.
I mean, it's weird. Like, it's being talked about more, but it's being talked about more in a negative way too.
You're absolutely right, Dan. And I remember reading that article, and I want to say it was in Texas that this happened, and they wrote on the child's head with the marker, and it's 2019, Dan.
Yeah, it's the current year. Don't you know that idiotic decisions made by people is totally old-fashioned?
It's 2019, and we're still having these conversations when it comes to equitable practices.
What? You still haven't said how something stupid done by an administrator who was suspended for it thus represents a hallmark of inequitable treatment. I mean, did I miss the news of an epidemic of school staff using Sharpie markers to color in black kids' scalps or something?
And I would agree that when it comes to race and equity, it's starting to be talked about a lot more. I think our education system has been changing in certain ways, and even from a political standpoint, things are starting to change. And so a lot of conversations about race are starting to come up.
How have things changed? And what conversations are coming up?
I think at the end of the day, we just need to make sure that everyone's voices are being heard and that we're allowing students a space that's safe for them.
You want to set up safe spaces. So, spaces without Sharpie markers. Got it.
Typically, when we talk about education, we see often, I think it's like 90% or upper 80% where it's education is predominantly white women teachers. Are the brunt of the teacher workforce. And then I think it's only like 2% of black males are educators. I mean, but when we look at the actual classroom setups and we look at all the classrooms where there's predominantly students of color or black students or brown students, and they don't often see themselves reflected within their teachers and role models and things like that. And then also in the content itself.
Oh, so when you say racial equity, you're talking about how like should only teach like. A white lady should not be teaching non-white students because she's a bad role model, because her skin is the wrong color. Is that what I am to understand?
And so that is why, a lot of the topics that I do discuss on my show center around race and center around how we can make sure that we're being culturally responsive and culturally providing culturally relevant and sustaining pedagogy to our students and utilizing their voices, so that it's not just us thinking about what we should be showcasing or providing to our students, or just teaching out of the textbooks only, but we're actually providing in celebrating assets that students are bringing to the table.
So in order to celebrate the assets that students are bringing to the table, you need to make sure that the right colored teacher is seeing to the same colored students. All of that education stuff is fine, but being culturally responsive via race matching is what's really important. Got it.
Yeah, I mean, you said it, man. It's 2019, and we're still dealing with not just a little bit, but a very large equity gap, I guess you would call it still.
An equity gap because of Sharpie markers and too many white ladies in education?
And, I've actually, 13 years into my career now, I will tell you, I've worked in 4 different schools, and every one of them has been super diverse. And demographically speaking, majority of students at each of the schools are students of color. And, I'll admit, at least in my area, that you're right. Our students do not have very many teachers who look like them and come from backgrounds like theirs.
And these are problems. Got it.
And the few that I've worked with who do and who are similar, sometimes, quite often, there is a different feel. I don't want to say it's a respect factor, but it's a different kind of connection that I think students have with staff members and teachers, especially, who are very similar to them. Their looks
it's
and their
connections,
backgrounds.
Right? It's like, males typically tend to connect better with other males, and females the same way. And then when we start talking about race, I mean, if I have a black student, I'm a black person. If I have black students, guess what? I can talk about a lot of things that they're into because I'm into it too.
So a more effective educational system would be one where the students are divided up by race and gender and are then only taught by teachers of that same race and gender. Got it.
There's a lot of shared experiences that we have, and it doesn't necessarily mean that I came from a hood and you came from the hood or the ghetto, or it doesn't matter. I mean, we're black and we both have a lot of similar experiences. We're treated to other people's eyes. They don't know where we come from. All they see is our race.
All people see is your race. So everyone around you is racist. Got it.
And so we get treated pretty much the same way. And so I think being able to connect with others that look like you is very important. It's just, how do we get more Black teachers involved into our school systems? And I think that's one of the things that we need to discuss, is because we talk about, the achievement gaps, and, we bring out these stats about how, the Black students are behind the white students, or the brown students are behind the white students.
And just curious, where do the Asian students reside on this racial hierarchy of achievement, I wonder?
I mean, there's some amazing students that are of all colors, but a lot of times we focus on these statistics and not focus on the assets that the students are bringing. I mean,
but you just focused on statistics. You just used statistics to support your argument of inequitable outcomes. And that was like 5 seconds ago. What?
if a student is behind when it comes to, let's say they're a fourth grader, but they're reading on a first grade level, well, we can still celebrate that student that's reading at a first grade level and see how we can bring them up to that fourth grade level, as opposed to, oh, see, I don't know why, these issues, these kids, their homes and this situation, that situation. We make these excuses as to why students are coming in behind, as opposed to, okay, this is where the student is at, and how do we get them up to where they need to be?
What does a fourth grader reading at a first grade level inherently have to do with racial equity? Either the kid has a learning disability, and or the teacher sucks, and or there's little support at home for their education. I'm confused.
When we had connected to do this interview and put out this episode, you mentioned a term that I have to be honest and in full disclosure, full transparency, I wasn't super familiar with, but I think it kind of relates to this misunderstanding piece, and the term is microaggressions.
What? You're an equity-sensitive educator, and you have never heard of the term microaggressions. Dude, it's like 2019.
Can you explain what the term means and also kind of how that comes to play in this equity piece?
I guess the short answer is we all do it. I do it too, Dan. So I'm not immune to this, but there's times when we unintentionally, and sometimes there's times when we intentionally say or do things to a person based off of maybe a stereotype, or we assume a certain thing, and it can trigger that person. So I'll give you an example. If I see someone that's Latino and I say, hey, I got some tortillas and some beans and rice. Do you want some?
What? Well, wait a second. If you already have tortillas, beans, and rice to eat, then offering them to someone who happens to be Latino, you're saying that would be a no-no. Got it? But besides which, you're having tortillas, beans, and rice is totally cultural appropriation. Or is that another term that our host has never heard of before?
And I asked them that because I looked at them and I saw that they were Latino. And they're like, well, I don't even like beans. And I'm like, well, why don't you like beans? Aren't you Mexican? Like, don't you like beans?
Okay. Well, yes. That would be a racially motivated assumption, or perhaps an ethnically motivated one. But that is not a microaggression. That's just being a straight-up racist. Man, our host doesn't know what the term means, and it sure doesn't look like our guest knows what the term means either.
Or if I call someone Mexican and they're really from Guatemala, that could trigger them. So it's unintentional. Like I'm not purposefully trying to say something disrespectful, but it's still, and that's the microaggression. That's where you say or do things unintentionally and it triggers someone in a certain way. I live in Idaho, Dan. And you know how many times I get asked if I play basketball or if I play football?
Really?
Like almost every day, all the time, right?
Right. So someone asking you if you play basketball or football triggers you. Gosh, I wonder what could possibly cause someone to ask you such a thing.
And I know that the person that's asking me these questions is, at least I hope that the person that's asking me these questions isn't, intentionally trying to stereotype me because they see a black man who, I try to keep myself in shape, but they see a black man and they just assume that I'm athletic and that I play sports or something like that. And, if it's an Asian person and I assume that they're really good at math, like those are the microaggressions. And when we act upon it, then that affects the way, like, just imagine being a student in class and, like a female in class, and the teacher says, your skirt is too tall or too short, or it's too low, or like the way that child might respond to it might be offensive to them. And then so there it could lead to further issues with the relationship between the teacher and the student.
I'm not even sure our speaker knows what he is talking about anymore. Okay. Tell you what, guys. I am going to listen to the rest of this podcast all by myself to see if they ever define and offer solutions for the issue of equity in the classroom. Be right back.
One eternity later.
Nope, they never do. The rest of the podcast is more platitudes and generalities, with the only solution offered being that more money and resources need to be dedicated to solving the problem, whatever that is. So, what have we learned from our educational experts today? Well, apparently, that the one tangible action that can increase equity in the classroom is to segregate teachers and students by race and gender. I really, really wish that I was kidding. As always, thank you for watching.